Welcome to the Exurbe ad Astra podcast, episode 5. How Writing is Like Fencing, with writer Max Gladstone, part 1. This conversation ran a little long, so we're splitting it into 2 parts for your listening convenience. This episode is brought to you by Perhaps the Stars, the 4th and final novel in Ada Palmer's Terra Ignota series, available now in the UK and in the US on November the 2nd, wherever fine books are sold.
Hello, welcome to the Exurbe podcast, where we talk about the craft of writing, history, science fiction, fantasy, science, and other nifty topics.
Hello, I'm Jo Walton, science fiction and fantasy writer and vocateur reader.
And I'm Ada Palmer, also an SF novelist and a historian of European thought, censorship, books, the Renaissance, and today, prepositions. I've been working a lot on prepositions.
And today we're going to talk about the craft of writing with our awesome friend Max Gladstone. Welcome, Max. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Gosh, I really shouldn't I? Hi, I'm Max Gladstone. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer primarily, also occasionally screenwriter, comics writer, games writer, basically anything that you can stick writer after. I've been it, want to be it, have done it at some point or another. Also a fencer by hobby and martial artist of a bunch of different types. Generally can embarrass myself by doing an awful lot of things with my body. Maybe that's something we should cut out of the podcast. Anyway, so that's me. I've been cheerfully quarantined for about 16 months now with my family, and I'm unused to broader human socialization. So we'll see how this goes.
And to start out, Joe remembered that Max had a very interesting way of comparing the craft of writing to the craft of fencing. And I also used to fence a bit and have a different comparison between the craft of writing and the craft of fencing. So we want to start by talking about Max's... Actually, you had 2 different sets of comparisons.
I'll see what I can do with the first one. Fencing, well, like writing, it's a complicated embedded skill set, right? You start off learning certain things that feel like basics, and then you feel as though you can progress to higher levels of things. But there's this tendency to see growth in the craft as monotonic, up and to the right all the time. Over time, you get better at each particular thing, and there's one stat that you're improving. You start off at +2 writing, and then you, after you sink enough points into it, you're at like +13 or whatever. But both of these skill sets are actually sets. They're composed of a lot of different sub-skills, and when you feel like you're improving, you may actually have focused on one specific element of the game and then left the other element at a beginner level until even relatively late in your development. When I started working with a new teacher, this would have been after maybe 5 or 6 years of fencing, sort of very regularly as an adult, I noticed that my stance was off in a very basic way. It was this combination of it was too low, and specifically it was not low enough in the back foot. And this was something that had been remarked on off and on in the course of, 7 years of fencing, but it was never something that I paid a great deal of attention to. And then I started focusing and thinking, okay, well, now let's just focus on changing that one hip joint. And then everything about the game changes all of a sudden. Not only was I faster on the strip and more responsive, but then I had to realign all of my other actions and like where my blade goes, because of course if you change like the position of your shoulder by about an inch up or down, suddenly your instinctive extension is no longer going where you think it's going lower, and it's going off target a little bit, so you got to realign there. And I've certainly felt like that with my growth with writing. There'll be moments where I will hear some extreme truism about scene composition, say, or character, and all of a sudden I realize, I've been doing that wrong since I was 15. Or if not wrong, then suddenly it opens up a whole new area for exploration. So there's a Kurt Vonnegut sort of bromide that gets thrown around, right? Your character has to want something, even if it's just a glass of water. And you'd think, of course, a character needs to want something. Like overall, people want, moral fulfillment. They want love. They want, the $11 million from the vault under the Bellagio, whatever it is. But then this was while I was working on the book that became Four Roads Cross. realizing that that applied not only in any particular scene, that in some ways it was actually better if the thing that the character wanted in the scene literally was a glass of water.
Was something that was attainable within that scene, so that that scene had an action and a process and a fulfillment.
Exactly. And to the extent that the scene was being dramatized, was playing out among other people in a physical space, as opposed to being a sort of high-level narrated scene that's covering a lot of other ground. If there were some moral or sort of deep character conflicts between the individuals in the scene, it was best and most fluid to encode those in physical objects that were around the room. So like somebody is picking up a file and putting down a file, referencing the fact that they just really wish this other person could get the heck out of the office and let them get back to their paperwork, or someone has a contract that needs to be signed that's representing the deal that they're going for. This all feels like extremely basic level blocking stuff when I'm saying it out loud, but it's stuff that I at least had just failed to realize was part of the way that, say, screenwriters compose scenes, because you can't narrate the internal action, so you need to encode it in something physical. And all of a sudden, when I started trying to do that encoding in each individual scene consciously, for one thing, it was like, oh gosh, well, what's happening now? I'll give you an extra problem to solve. But also it stopped a lot of my reflexive tics, which at that point were very like character picks up a cup of coffee, puts down a cup of coffee, somebody lights a cigarette, snuffs out the cigarette, you know those things that we eating or drinking. So I made myself a rule for that book that nobody would be eating or drinking in scenes unless they just really, really needed to drink or eat something, because that's easy. It's the Brad Pitt munching on shrimp cocktail throughout Ocean's 11 of writing advice. Do you all feel this at all? Have you felt like
I was thinking of the time when I suddenly had to write a scene that had 11 people in it, and most of them could time travel, so they had no reason to actually not be there. If they went out for anything, they could come back 2 seconds later, having been away for however long they wanted. And it was really hard, and I was thinking, why am I doing this to myself? It's just like the basic thing you learn not to do in terms of having too many people in a scene. And there was I in my 13th or 14th novel, and I'd written myself into this ridiculous corner.
Well, Emma, and sometimes you don't know, because of the plot essential things, there's no way this conversation can take less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
How do I make that work? For me, thinking of concentrating on high-level writing craftsmanship and losing track of simpler stuff had me thinking a lot about when you give a description of the physical space when you're transitioning to a new scene in a new location. And, the basic skill there is quickly and without wasting time giving enough of a sense of the space that the reader isn't confused as to where we are, and that the things that are going to happen in that scene won't be confusing. So, for example, if this is going to be a scene where somebody is going to attack somebody, you have to have given enough of a description for the reader to get a sense that they know how hard or easy it is to physically get out of the space, so that they won't be confused when a character can or can't be pinned down or something. On a basic level, you're establishing for the reader where the characters are, and enough of the physicality that the action that's gonna follow makes sense. But then there are all of these secondary higher level things that a description of a space can be doing, because the description can invoke another space that we've been in recently by having similar colors or similar adjectives, so that the reader, without necessarily realizing it, is reminded of that earlier scene, and then the themes of the two get connected together. Or the description can use poetic language of a particular type, so that it can use very Homeric poetic language, or it can use very Enlightenment poetic language, or it can use very modern language, which can set a tone or a mood for the thing. And you can sometimes be doing a description and you're saying, aha, this is a scene in which there's about to be a surprise betrayal. So I'm going to have the description be really calming and beautiful and serene and use lots of really calm adjectives in the 2-sentence description of where we are to make the betrayal extra surprising because the reader will be in a calm, relaxed mood. Or you can do the opposite of I'm going to use lots of sinister adjectives. And when I say what shade of red the carpet is, I'm going to compare it to, an old scar as opposed to comparing it to a glass of wine so that, I'm establishing a different mood. And then there's a whole other set of layers you can do when you've got a narrator who is giving the description, because then you can get across using the narrator's language, whether the narrator is happy, whether the narrator is upset, whether the narrator remembers this space vividly, whether the narrator kind of barely remembered this space or had to ask somebody else about it. And, even if you're confining yourself to 2 sentences, you can actually get a huge amount of things done that connect to theme, that connect to characterization, that set up this and that. And you can get so distracted by doing those things that the reader gets to the end and is like, how many doors were there in the room? Why didn't she go out the door if there was a door? And you're like, oh, I failed at the original. They have to understand the physical space enough to not be confused about the action that's going to happen in the scene.
Yeah. When the sniper shoots somebody through the window, you don't want the reader to be like, there are windows?
Yeah. Exactly. I had a conversation about this at one point with a person who phrased very well I hate it when the author is spending a lot of time telling me what pixels they want me to render in my head.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good way of putting when the author has a clear visualization of what the thing is and really wants to make you visualize it that way too. And sometimes you get it with a space, and sometimes you get it with a piece of tech. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you get it, especially in older SF, you'll get it with when the female character walks in and she has almond eyes and her face is this shape. And it goes on for like a whole paragraph and you forget it all immediately. Mm-hmm. Because none of that is actually accomplishing any of those other goals. It isn't giving us information we need to understand the following scene. It isn't telling us something about the point of view of a first-person narrator. It's just the author trying to communicate, I have a really cool idea of what this thing looks like, and I want you to have that idea of what that thing looks like, too.
It's interesting to me how the demands of prose fiction may or may not have changed in the last 100 years with the rise of different, ways to convey visual story to a reader. I am reading a lot of turn of the last century adventure fiction right now. So I'm reading, Scaramouche and Tarzan and John Carter and all of these things. And there, it's very common to have a big old paragraph of, and the person's eyes were this way and set in this way and their face and the protruding cheeks and this micro details about the mouth. And you feel as though this is really something that, Sabatini feels like they need to explain to you so you have a vivid sense of who this person is. And I wonder if we expect readers now to, have seen more faces, or just to, if we really cared about the particular way that this person's face looked, it would just be a movie or a comic or something. I don't know.
I think it's because of movies and movie pacing and because of the influence of movies on writing initially with Hemingway and modernism.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
That put us into that tight third that is sometimes called camera eye.
Yeah.
And took us away from those leisurely descriptions that people in the 19th and the early 20th century were perfectly happy to sit still for.
Yeah.
And then now you've really got to be giving them something. It's really got to be necessary if you're doing that kind of thing. I thought that when I was reading Stephen Brust's Parfy novels, which are kind of pastiches of old translations of Dumas, but he does a lot of the tricks that Dumas does, but he does not do that. Now we're going to sit down and describe the face in real detail. style thing unless he's doing something else with it, unless he's doing it, as Ada was saying, because I think even in a pastiche, the modern reader has learned to lean away from that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of the examples of in Sherlock Holmes stories, Watson will give a couple of sentences describing the architectural exterior of the building where they go to see the crime scene or interview the person, and then will give 1 or 2 sentences of description of the person. And I think in many ways the shift is definitely shaped by movies in part. And I also think that, when you're thinking of a 19th century long, vivid description of a storm or a beautiful description of a faraway place, the person having the chance to sit there and visualize that for a minute and a half is the equivalent of watching a movie pan across the beautiful landscapes.
Sure.
But I think another thing that has changed is that we have pushed so hard against phrenology and against judging people's character by their faces. And so in 19th century and very beginning of the 20th century, things like Sherlock Holmes, you get these very detailed descriptions of people's faces with the idea that they're setting the moral character of the person from the facial description.
Yeah.
And Watson is always talking about people having nature's danger signals is the phrase he uses, written in their face, and having a strong jaw or a weak jaw. And this is the establishment of the character in a way that we're not comfortable with later on when we think of facial physiognomy as less related to personality. We still do have lots of issues where, beautiful or good-looking hero and heroine, and movies exaggerate this, will be good, and where villains are often disfigured or ugly. But we don't have the, this person's strong brow and black hair, which looks slightly unnative in an Englishman, is the warning that he's a little bit corrupt, but not as corrupt as the other guy who looks German,
Shock Germans. That's fantastic. A really good point. I've often wondered in passing, reading 19th century fiction especially, if there's this whole sort of data stream of phrenological information that I just am not privy to. Like, what information is somebody like Dickens meaning me to get from this or that protrusion of the head, or this detail about where the eyes are placed or sunk or positioned? Like, does not feel like it's just descriptive.
Well, and that's why it parallels so directly the descriptions of buildings, because Watson is always saying it was a Middle Georgian edifice with this detail, and I'm like, I am a historian and I barely know what this means. But a person in the period does know what that means, because he's writing for the local readership of the people who are reading a London paper and so on, who have seen buildings like this and have a good sense of that. And so it's like being fluent in the vocabulary of a specialization. It's like being fluent in fashion, or being fluent in phrenology, or being fluent in architecture of England and London and its peripheries.
I guess you have a modern equivalent of this. You could describe somebody's living room as looking like an Apple store, and I would know exactly what you would mean. Yeah.
But if the 19th century person could read that, they'd be imagining barrels of apples. And it's perfectly possible that in another 100 years, when consumer names will be only vaguely memorable, people will be picturing those barrels of apples again. It's kind of adorable, actually.
Well, and it's another example of things changing meaning over time, because if you could, instead of saying Apple Store, you could say you went into the apartment and everything was clean white surfaces with a natural stone floor and huge full wall windows, and you almost couldn't see any clutter anywhere. It was as if everything was a perfectly molded white cube. And we understand how to interpret that in terms of aesthetic and a corporate aesthetic, and also in terms of affluence. But I could easily see in 100 years someone looking at that and thinking, oh, it's so empty and barren. This must be intending to communicate an impoverished person, right? If everything is bare and plain and undecorated.
I spent a lot of the last year reading Proust, and the extremely wealthy families that Marcel, the narrator, runs into will often have entire sort of spare wings of furniture lying around because, the Louis Couture stuff is not in fashion right now, but we'll just keep it around until it's in fashion again.
Yeah.
There's a profusion of stuff in all of the rich people's homes and all the wealthy homes, and and that does not seem to be true of our current affluent aesthetic, even if there is a lot of stuff.
But it's part of the claustrophobic atmosphere that Proust is building up, I think.
True.
As well.
Yeah, which is another example of how the description of that clutter, the description of the physical space, it communicates social class and affluence and history and the fact that this is an old wealthy family and not a new wealthy family, but it also helps cultivate that overall claustrophobic feel which shapes the mood of the narrative and sets up elements of story that are unrelated to that particular family's social class, but that are a larger atmospheric development of things.
It's fascinating when you start thinking about these kinds of things on another planet or on a spaceship.
Yes.
In terms of extra furniture, because we have this futuristic aesthetic that kind of comes again from Hemingway, but from early science fiction and 1930s ideas of the future as clean lines. And you don't often see a Baroque spaceship.
Yes, outside of Vampire Hunter D, I guess.
Well, and they also tend not to be claustrophobic and cluttered if they're even a little bit into the future. And I think that's directly related to film and television having to have spaces that are large enough for the physical camera to move around in. Which mean that spaceships visualized on television has always had large enough cabins to be the size of a room instead of tiny cramped ones, unless they're working really hard on accuracy in something like the Apollo 13 movie. But just about everything else, even when they're working hard on accuracy, if it's an imagined space like in The Martian, which is, mediumly near future contemporaneous tech level, and yet the interior of the spaceship is enormous. And there's that gymnasium with a row of 4 elliptical trainer machines next to the treadmills. And, you could probably fit the whole ISS in that 3 times. And those establish for us an aesthetic where spaceships aren't claustrophobic. We've seen hundreds of spaceships in TV shows and movies, and they've never been claustrophobic except for the ones that are contemporaneous tech level. And so that sets up claustrophobic spaceship equals near future contemporaneous tech level.
There was a Twitter thing bouncing around a while ago, which was a frame from a show that was set at a university, where in the professor's office was this huge, capacious thing, and the people were dunking on this frame, saying Hollywood thinks my office looks like this, and exactly to your point, no, Hollywood doesn't necessarily think that that's what a professor's office looks like. It's just that it's really hard to fit 3 cameras, a lighting guy, several lighting, the grip, the craft services table, and all of that into what's out of camera.
While I think you're absolutely right, it's hard to fit that in. They nevertheless do manage to do historical movies where things are cluttered.
True.
They still might be bigger than they ought to be, but there's still clutter in a way that you won't see in the future.
Yeah.
And that isn't the case when people are writing things in the future and on other planets and so on. But the clutter still isn't there.
Yeah.
True.
Or is only uncommonly there, as I talked about in my intro for the new Tor Essentials Book of the New Sun, which is a series that has clutter.
Yes.
It has cluttered mountains.
Yeah, it has literal clutter mountains. That clutter in the future is a sign of a particular couple of veins of SF style, one of which is cyberpunk, which will have tech clutter and often sort of urban junk clutter. And another vein is, deep future, layery, Baroque, Book of the New Sun type science fiction futures. You get science fiction futures that are mountains of trash that are commenting on consumerism and on eco things, which don't tend to mean positive clutter, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
The clutter there is a sign of a past era being decadent or a past era being irresponsible, and often of the impoverishment of the new era that it must live on the trash of the old era.
It does feel like there is like that our specific, maybe this last 20 or 30 years media moment has a weird sense of how internal spaces are supposed to look, or what a good internal space looks like. It's very minimalist. It's very like, you know, watching people's houses on television, or watching the homes after the Queer Eye crew gets done with them. And, you know, it's just, where are all the books?
Yes.
Just where? where can they be?
Where are the collections of things you collect?
Yes.
Where are the things your aunt gave you that you couldn't get rid of, but that are there on the shelf and don't quite match the other things? I think we all have some of those things.
Sure do.
And where's the pile of things you have to take to the post office, but you've been putting it off?
A thing that I've been thinking recently with having quite a lot of Zoom meetings is how different people's actual houses, when you see them behind their heads, are, both from each other and from what you tend to see as houses in media.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so.
Even with the attempt to curate your Zoom background, which I know some people have engaged in.
Well, I think we see in reality a lot of a room where there's stuff, but there's no art on the walls. There's no wall decor, which is something that, you know, people who are renting a place and are only going to be there for a year or two, or don't have permission from the landlord to put a hole in the wall for a nail, very often live with for long periods. And you never see. Everything always has the tasteful, correct amount of decoration, even if it's then supposed to be the murder room, so all the furniture has been tossed to the side or whatever. All of which then, returning slightly to when we're describing this to the reader, because of course you want to describe enough that it accomplishes things, and that it accomplishes things that are consonant with the scene that is about to occur in the space, which means, you know, there will be plenty of points at which you might be describing a room and you think, hey, this would be a great moment at which there could be clutter in this room in order to push back against the clutterless future. But actually describing the clutter right now interferes with the flow of things. And so the correct answer in that moment is no. Actually, you know, it already takes a couple sentences to get across where the three exits are that are all going to be relevant when the army call happens. So this is a moment to say, I'm not going to fight that battle now. I'm gonna have clutter at a different moment.
True, or to bake it into the scene in some other way later on, if that's something you care about. The question of fighting battles is one that I'm going back over and over in my mind about. One wants to serve the story. I don't know. At what point do you fight the battles, I guess? Like,
you mean the metaphorical ones of trying to advance a particular...
Yeah, especially when it's something like, I will occasionally see people talking about fantasy with potatoes in it, for example, or this particular way that mountains are in your world. And like, I understand that these critiques or comments are coming from a place of love, of deep engagement with the medium, but I guess the question in the end becomes, is it generative to you to conceive of a fantasy world without potatoes and to sort of ask those kinds of questions and follow them through, or is it not?
I was writing something once and I was doing a very intensive and annoying piece of research so I could get it right. And I said to Ada, do I actually have to do this? And she said, only 3 people will care. But unfortunately, one of them is you.
Yes.
So I think we do the things we care about.
Yeah.
And that's why you'll actually get people who really care about potatoes, and I wouldn't put potatoes in a fantasy world, or at least I wouldn't put potatoes in medieval Europe. I might put them in a fantasy world if I had a reason. But we do the things we care about, and that's why we default to cliches. And that's why we default to worlds that are slightly racist and slightly sexist.
True.
Because when you default to cliche, that's what you do. You go with the stereotype. And you can't examine everything and think about everything. So you think about the things that you care about and you stick with the things that you care about.
I also think it happens on a couple different planning levels, because sometimes it's I'm planning out the whole story I'm working on the economy. What layers of social class do I want to have? Do I want to have layers of social class that engage with social class issues, or do I sort of not? Do I want this to be one of the projects of the book is engaging with this issue of class or this issue of race or this other thing? And you might have a character like, oh, yes, I've realized that there's a great opportunity to have a disabled character, and I can have interesting medical details along the way, and then this will happen. But there'll be other points where, like, a messenger has to be picked out of a crowd of people to go to a place. And you're like, a messenger. This messenger doesn't have a name, doesn't need to have any attributes, and will never appear again, but we don't have cell phones to just text, so we have to send a person on a horse. Oh, neat. This could be a person who's lost a foot, but who can still ride. Because that is something that Viking texts tell us Vikings did, is give the riding jobs to the person who had an injured leg. And, we're never going to see this person again, but it's a handy moment of visibility for that interesting issue or an inclusivity that just came up over the course of it. And so similarly with food, there's I'm doing my world build and I'm thinking through which are the staple crops of this world, and are they farming something that's very dense yield but high labor per acre, like rice, in which case the peasantry is very dense, in which case the speed at which peasant rebellions can rise is extremely high compared to a wheat-based culture or a corn-based culture. And that can be a deep part of your world build. But then there can also be the moment at which you realize that this person is being interrupted at supper and freezes with their spoon full of grits, and you either think about it or you don't. And the easy thing is to do stew, and that's a moment where you're like, oh, I could take a moment to have it be an unexpected thing that is in the spoon that accomplishes something that moves in the direction of accuracy or research or brassica knowledge or whatever it is that I care about food-wise, or I can realize, no, this is a moment that there's already so much going on and people are easily distracted by a detail like that. The correct thing to say is he froze with the spoon by his mouth and then dropped it without eating, and not to say what was in the spoon, because I don't want the reader at that moment distracted by thinking about that. And it's funny how often now I'm working on something that is real historical, so I am doing a lot of pausing and looking up and figuring out the thing. And I'd say half the time I figure out the thing, and I figure out that the thing is unexpected enough to most readers that describing the thing at that particular moment would be too distracting and interfere with the flow. And the correct answer is to not describe what's in the spoon, not describe what the bag is made of. I have that knowledge, it might appear at a different point. But I would say half the time, even when I've worked out the detail, I realize afterward that the detail is unfamiliar enough that there isn't space for it.
I love that as a tactical decision.
Yeah.
If you're having someone rush in while people are eating pie and somebody has their, is just digging in their fork full of pie, fine. But if it's 1410, and so someone is bursting into the room with their pie and they are cracking open the crust of their pie with a nutcracker, the reader is distracted by this fact and no longer cares about what the message is, because really, pie used to be something so hard you would have to crack it open by force. And now they're no longer thinking about the other thing. And so I might say, wow, the fact that you have to crack pie open by force is awesome. I'm going to save that for chapter 8 when there's a moment when I want there to be a break and there's just been something tense, and then the characters are going to be having a cheering and more relaxing conversation, which is a good moment for fun and unexpected and odd interaction with food. And one character can have trouble cracking the pie and someone else can help them crack the pie. And there's a dog and they can give the dog the bits of the crust and the dog can gnaw on them, and it'll be a fun inclusion instead of an intrusive though accurate inclusion. And then in the other scene where we needed to move quickly to the thing that was happening, we don't have the pie. And that, too, is a very important consideration and is a reason that we default to the simple things. Because if I just have a pie, the person have stew, which is the default fantasy food, then it's not going to distract the reader at all from the scene. And so it's easy to move through. Anything that isn't the default intrudes itself upon the consciousness of the reader slightly more, and sometimes takes up too much of the pie chart of what the reader is thinking about for the rest of the scene to work.
A long time ago, I was working on a role-playing game in the 90s. And this role-playing game sort of billed itself as having gender equality, and it really did make a lot of effort in that direction. And I'd been thinking about these kinds of default things that we do, and I decided in this fantasy world in which women were completely equal to men, I was going to make all of my NPCs randomly male or female. And I would literally alternate, and whatever the last one was, the other one would be different, and that's what I was doing. And when I submitted this, the editor was like, "This is all women. I can't use this. You've just got too many women. This is ridiculous. It's all women." Even though it was literally 50-50.
Huh.
Right.
So it completely distracted them from what the thing was doing, that I had people in both menial positions and power positions who were randomly women. And they didn't at all see that I'd done that whole thing. And it's very, very interesting, because now, if that had been published and that was available now, I think people would see it as ordinary that there's a lot of women, and they'd be saying, why aren't there any trans characters? Why is this so binary? Because we've come a long, long way in the last 20 years on all that stuff.
Yeah, you're reminding me of when there's a really great co-op board game called Ghost Stories, which is themed around Taoist monks defending a village from ghosts.
Love that game.
And I had noticed that there are conspicuously many female ghosts in the monster deck. So out of curiosity, I sat down and sorted and discovered that there was precise, which means someone worked on it, precise down to the individual number, gender parity, precisely 1/3 male monsters, 1/3 female monsters, and 1/3 ungendered blob, killer, tree, plant, water things, right? that were not like a human thing at all, and therefore genderless. And it was like, yes, the 3 genders, male, female, and pus monster.
Killer tree.
It felt so wonderful.
That's amazing. I'd never noticed that.
But also that I had become conspicuously conscious that there were a lot of female ghosts and not that there were a lot of genderless ones. That the genderless ones didn't stand out to me, and the female ones did stand out to me, even though the female ones were 1/3 of the total.
Well, my memory of Ghost Stories also is that the monsters that are not identifiable as having male or female gender are rarely identifiable as having human physiognomy at all, like giant blob monster with 40 mouths or killer tree.
Or feet.
Yes, yes, right.
Yeah, which is physiognomy, but didn't
fair enough.
have a chance for gender there.
Yes, yeah, my brain isn't jumping on that and trying to gender the giant killer tree.
Right. If it had been 1/3 human-looking bodies which were without gender cues and seemed androgynous, my brain would be more likely to have noticed that than when it's 1/3 just
Tree.
Here's a tree. Trees sometimes have gender, but not very often.
All of this is just reminding me of the social science finding that men specifically in meetings tend to believe that, like instinctively, if you ask somebody gut check, what was the split in the meetings, at about 1/3 women, they'll believe that it was 50-50, and at 50-50, they'll like think that most of the people in the room were women. And similar results obtained with talking time. I think that's withstood the repeatability crisis, but
yeah, I recall it doing so. And so how much we notice you have a lot of X type of character and how much we don't.
But it's the same if it's potatoes. Some people will really notice and really care about the potatoes.
Yes. There's a lot of discourse about the importance of having representation of people of different races and people of different religiosities and people of different genders and sexualities and physical comportments. But that one fan who was like, oh my god, this scene is taking place in Brussels. My home country exists in a science fiction book. They're down the street from my house. They have the name of the street correct. This is the most amazing thing that has ever happened.
Yeah.
There are always going to be categories of representation that you never thought of because it's potato enthusiast hobbyists who will be ecstatic if you have not just potatoes potatoes, but potatoes that are purple on the outside, but yellowish on the inside, because it's this rare, I'm just making this up, but this rare, real breed of potato that existed one time. There's always going to be some people for whom the thing that you're including is a major thrill.
For sure.
And similarly, if you get it wrong.
Yes, and similarly, if you get it wrong. And there are also going to be things where you know a whole heck of a lot about this thing, and you have to hold your hand. You have to say, heaven help me if it's ever plausible for there to be a fish tank in somebody's room in a book, because I'm so tempted to describe the siphon setup and the pH monitor on the thing, and exactly what the fish are doing and at what angle they're hovering relative to each other to communicate territory. And no, I just have to say there's a fish tank. The scene is involving the things that are happening in the room.
You need to count on your betas to sort of escort you gently away from the fish tank at that point.
Well, and I was thinking about this earlier, Max, with your discussions of how writing is affected by living alongside visual media. Because an interesting element of comic books and other visual media is that you can have a lot of detail on a minor background thing.
Yes. Without
it taking the consumer of the medium, the reader or the watcher, any extra time. It doesn't affect the pacing. So if you have a scene with a super accurate fish tank behind your character, in a comic book, you can have all the detail on that fish tank. And unless there's a fish tank hobbyist who will sit there and look at it carefully, everyone else will still read through it at the same pace, and it doesn't matter. And so you can, in a weird way, have a whole lot of detail in certain directions without it affecting pacing when it's visual, in a way you can't when it's text, which also makes certain types of tricks harder or easier. So, for example, if you want to have your characters enter a space and there's a statue in this space, and the statue is going to be important and meaningful a couple chapters later, but you're trying to slyly sneak the statue in and not have people think about it too much. You have to work hard. You can do it. You can have your characters are having a picnic and there's someone on the bench, and so they end up sitting on the bottom of the statue, and it feels plausible that they're sitting there, and there can be a reflection on it being slightly uncomfortable. But it can be hard to slide in something visual, whether it's something you need for the story later or whether it's just, the presence of an object in text, because every sentence is a sentence and affects how quickly the information is coming along. And you have to make it fit into the background. And the example that made me first think hard about this is the second Ghost in the Shell manga.
I don't know if I've ever read that one.
It is the most fascinating study I've ever seen in the author's attention to detail and concerns about what the reader needs to understand being completely orthogonal to my effort to understand what's happening. Because this is an extremely hard to follow cyberpunk narrative in which sometimes we're inside people's minds and sometimes we're not. And there's something confusing with a kidnapped president and cloned pigs. And I and a bunch of different friends who all read this together had the general sense that at any given time, we could pretty much figure out either what Kusanagi was doing or why she was doing it, but never both at once. Okay, here she's destroying all of these pigs, and now she's interacting with something blue in order to save this president, but I don't know what she's doing, but whatever it is going to save the president. Okay, now she's destroying this tree, and it was just this back and forth of I can never figure out actually both what's going on and what's happening. But boy, were the motorcycles drawn in meticulous detail and all the little connections and the details in the engine. And then in one issue, there was a footnote that just said, see page blah, blah, blah for a correction of and explanation of something confusing in the previous issue. And I was like, oh, it's going to tell me what's happening with those pigs. This is great. Flip, 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 flip. Artist wants to apologize that the gas pipe of the motorcycle in panel 6 on page 23 had a tube that connected the wrong way to the thing because clearly the exhaust system, blah, 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 blah. And the entire thing was about the motorcycle engine. And I was so stunned. I was like, okay. I understand where your love is in this story. It is in the motorcycle engine design, and it is beautiful to you, and I admire your beauty, but I would love to understand what is actually occurring in this narrative.
I encountered the Ghost in the Shell manga for the first time when I think I must have been 11 in Davis Kid Bookseller in Nashville, Tennessee, and my like ability to understand it was far outpaced by my utter fascination for everything that was going on. So I remember having that exact experience with, I don't know, the Russian geofront gold smuggling. There's a secret agent who we've never met before. Like that episode, I spent like a really long time as a kid trying to figure out exactly what was going on. And the text was full of footnotes in the old Dark Horse edition. At least there were like 40 pages, and they were all... A real gun would probably not have an ammo ejector that looked like this, but I thought it was extremely cool.
Yes.
As you see, this optical film accomplishes this thing. I'm like, Shiro, man, can't you just tell me what's going on? It was very good. It prepared me for reading like Mike Ford later. Not that Mike Ford has the hyper focus on the firearms details issues, but I think trying to figure out Shiro's story against his every inclination as a storyteller prepared me for harder and more rewarding science fictional texts later on in life.
Well, sometimes one comes to find delight in a writer's tick when you've realized that it's motivated by love. Mm-hmm. I think the best known example of this is probably the feasts in the Redwall books. You know, there are these endless feasts, and they're extremely repetitive and delightfully endearing.
Yes.
And clearly the subject of the author just delighting and describing these feasts over and over, and they become endearing in the same way that the motorcycle, after I read that footnote, I actually started finding delight in it because I knew another human being was finding delight in it, and it was a sort of a vicarious feeling glad for a friend being happy, getting to draw this exciting motorcycle. Oh, now the exciting motorcycle has been cut in half so we can see the inside. He must be so excited right now. It would be my thought. Seeing the motorcycle getting cut in half. Meanwhile, I have no clue what is happening in terms of narrative, but I took joy in it.
Yeah, you want to find something that you feel joy in the way that Katsuhiro Otomo feels joy in people's hands.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
4,000 pages of Akira and every single finger is drawn perfectly.
Or that scene, I think it's a 14-page sequence of Alucard and Anderson's boots as they walk toward each other down a hallway. Yeah, I learned so much about the author from that sequence. I was like, those are really cool boots. I feel now that I have seen them from every angle several times. But boy, was that a person who enjoyed drawing those boots for 14 pages. And boy, did that prepare me for the unforgettable moment in the volume where we finally get to meet and understand the character in Helsing who's called the Major, utterly unrelated to the one of the same name in my series. And he starts giving this speech about how much he likes evil while standing against a blank black background. And he keeps giving this speech about how much he loves evil for 69 pages.
Whoa.
Nothing else happens. It's just him going on about evil for more than half of the manga volume. And I was reading it, it was like, he is. He's really doing this. This character is just going to have an evil monologue for the entire rest of this book. That's somehow amazing.
At that point, why is it not text?
Because the facial expressions were a very intense component of it. And the total number of words in this would probably have only been a single page of text, because so much of it was his facial expression while he pronounces a single word.
Okay, fair enough.
And, you know, well, I'm not necessarily going to recommend this as a model to writing students. It was a fascinating experience. And very interesting to compare to then the sequence in Berserk when a very large and complex battle, which initiates as a battle between a bunch of humans and a bunch of other humans, but they're also monsters, and it gets more complex. There's a sequence of over 100 pages without any words at all. Over 100 pages that is just the physicality of that fight. And seeing the sides change and seeing the ebb and flow of battle as the threat is over here, and then the threat moves, and then the threat changes, in the physical expressions and movement of bodies in space, mostly of images of many bodies in space. And it was absolutely stunning. And it was exactly the sort of thing that would be very challenging to do, though interesting, in written text of, can I communicate the ebb and flow and side changing and new alliances forming and others going away simply from the aerial view of how the bodies are moving, changing, without any dialogue. And that would be a very fascinating challenge to do in text, but it was amazing seeing it done visually like that for so long in pure body language.
I'm struck by the differences also in the mangaka sort of model versus American and English comics.
The words per page thing?
Yeah, well, not just the words per page thing, but what happens when you have a gulf between the writer and artist. You know, I'm forgetting the mangaka of Berserk, his name. He passed away recently. It's very sad.
Kentaro Miura.
Ah, excellent. So Kentaro Miura is conceiving of the story and executing the story in his own head without an intermediate script stage that needs to then be passed to a separate artist and legible to that artist. Whereas you look at Alan Moore's scripts for really just about anything, and the density of background information that he wants to convey is sort of achingly clear. You know, the Watchmen scripts will have pages of all caps typed text to establish a single panel of 9 on a page, most of which is meant to be either unseen or noticed on the 7th reading, or just something that somebody happens to go deep into as their eye rests on the page. It's interesting just to me the effect of that separation, that it needs to go through this intermediary stage.
Yeah, which manga sometimes sort of has in the form of, depending on how the author works with their assistants.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes the assistants are drawing the background and then the author is drawing the character into it.
Oh, fascinating.
In which case the author has to communicate to those assistants enough, but they'll often be physically in the same space. So that they're showing each other a sketch and you can point at it. So it's another model of workflow of plural authorship.
And then there's the script writing model, which, at least the one that I've had some experience with, you're really trying to give everybody on the production something to do. So, you need to convey the kind of space this is, but then not do the set dresser's job for them. You need to give a character line, but then leave space for the actor to interpret it and run with it, because that's what's going to get the actor excited about signing on to the project, not thinking that everything's going to be micromanaged for them.
Yeah. Well, and that you're reminding me of, and I'd love to hear Joe reflect on this afterwards, the degree to which, when you're writing, or especially reading the script of a play, how easy it is to lose track of the people who are on stage but haven't spoken in a while or never speak, even though they can be very significant physical presences, and that's how the text can read very differently from how it looks on stage. And I was part of a project at UNC Chapel Hill a number of years ago on Roman comedy in performance, where we wanted to film some examples of individual scenes from Roman comedies filmed in a number of different ways to help make clear to audiences, especially in a classroom context, how different choices that the directors or actors have made can make things very different. But the scene that we did the most different versions of, I think we did 6, we intentionally chose a scene which is a pimp who is addressing and threatening his slave prostitutes as he prepares them to go do their thing. And none of them ever speaks. It is a long scene with clearly at least 8 characters on the stage the whole time, but only one speaking part. So when you just read it on paper, it feels like a monologue. Except he is addressing people, but none of the people he addresses ever speaks, and almost all of them are never seen again in the play, in the text at least. And what was so interesting was then to see how completely different it felt, depending on what physicalities and locations and physical interactions you gave to those other figures. Are they sniggering behind his back? Are they talking to each other? Oh, I forgot that there are other speakers. There's 2 characters who are eavesdropping, who are watching the sequence and comment on the sequence, but also aren't interacting with the row of 6 people who are being threatened. And so it's just a very interesting instance of how, a screenplay which does give some of the things and actions that the unspeaking characters are doing is so radically different from the attempt to experience a work that was written for stage when you're reading only the script as we have for a Roman comedy or Shakespeare.
I realised years ago that when I read scripts, I never actually enjoy them. But I absolutely love live theatre, and I really, really love seeing theatre. And I can read a script after I've seen a play and enjoy it. But if I just read the script, it is as if I haven't really experienced the thing. But I had a very interesting experience recently. During lockdown, I've been doing Saturday night Shakespeare readings with the Scintillation Discord. So it's all audio. And at this point, we've actually done all of Shakespeare. We have read the complete works of Shakespeare. It's really neat. And when we were doing Macbeth, there is the scene which is thought of as Lady Macbeth's mad scene. Mm-hmm. But she doesn't actually speak for most of it.
Yeah.
And when you see it, she's there and her presence is huge. And then she speaks towards the end, but people are discussing her being mad while she is on stage. I've seen her running to and fro and wringing her hands, but she's always very visually there. But doing it just in audio, we couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. And it was Sherwood Smith who was playing Lady Macbeth, the writer. And she thought about this ahead of time because she was really familiar with the play. And so at the beginning of the scene, when they start talking about her being mad, she started to giggle very quietly. And she kept up this incredibly creepy giggling, getting louder until when she spoke. And she did this very loud laugh as she launched into the speech. And it was amazing. It sent chills up my spine. It was incredible. The physicality of the laugh that was not on the page, and that I'd never seen Lady Macbeth laugh in her madness. But because we didn't have the visuals, it was brilliant.
Well, and it reminds me of a thing that then also connects back to the interesting challenges in prose versus theatre. So one of the challenges of making filmed versions of The Tempest is that throughout the majority of The Tempest, Ariel, who's often the character in which modern audiences are most invested because this is an awesome, magic, cool spirit thing, is on stage watching the other stuff happen. And very frequently, especially if you have a good director and a good Ariel's facial expression and physical reactions while watching the other characters can be the most powerful part of the play. And Ariel watches the lovers and, is Ariel an inhuman spirit that has trouble understanding human emotion and sort of looks on this confusion and awe? When Ariel is watching the bad guys, what is Ariel's face? And I've had the experience of watching a Tempest live in a theater, which was great, and then watching a filmed version of that same Tempest and it being meh. Because filming it requires not seeing Ariel most of the time because we're looking at the character who's speaking. Mm-hmm. And it's actually very difficult to film The Tempest among all of Shakespeare's works. Because for modern audiences whose investment is so heavily in Ariel, you're constantly wanting to see Ariel, and that challenges the camera angles and also our expectation that there will be a close-up of people speaking when they're speaking. Thinking about similarly in text when you have an eavesdropping scene like that. If you're writing a novel of those scenes of The Tempest, let us imagine, how do we communicate Ariel as an important element and Ariel witnessing this as an important element? One way is to have Ariel's POV happening. Another way is to periodically describe Ariel's expression, but that requires interrupting the flow of the conversation just as we might have to interrupt it to describe a motorcycle or to describe other things. And sometimes that might be great. Sometimes the dialogue might have gotten to a moment when the characters pause and, there's a tension between them, and that's a great moment to describe what the witness in the rushes is doing. But you have to back and forth and weave very carefully, and it also means that the writer has absolute control over when the audience is experiencing the characters who are speaking and when the audience is experiencing Ariel. because the author chooses when to describe Ariel and when to describe the others. The reader, of course, will sometimes be thinking about Ariel when looking at the thing, or even thinking about Caliban, who isn't even on stage, or thinking about how this reminds them of the Expanse, or whatever they're thinking about. But the author has complete control over the sequence of how often Ariel is described versus how much the others are looked at, in a way that the playwright doesn't have. Because on stage, it's up to the audience member when they look at Ariel and when they look at the people on stage. And some people may look at Ariel all the time, and other people may not look at Ariel very much at all, and other people may be at a seat at a weird angle that affects whether they do or don't look at Ariel. And in that sense, it's similar, and this is another interesting craft of writing genre that I wonder, actually, Max, if this is one of the genres you have or haven't worked in, which is the explanatory text for a museum exhibit.
Ooh.
Because the fascinating thing about the explanatory text for a museum exhibit is that it is prose, but you cannot control fully the physical movement of the people in the space, so you don't know in what order they're going to read it. You can try to put some things closer to the entrance and put some things in room 1 and some things in room 2, but when they walk up to the case and there's the big explanatory text and the small explanatory text and 3 objects, you do not control which one they read first, second, and third, and you also don't control whether they do bother to read them all or whether they only cursorily look at that because the next case has shiny armor and they move on to that one and then move backward. So you have to construct your narrative of what this is that you're introducing to people and your arguments that the exhibit text as a whole is making, while realizing you have very imperfect control over the order in which the individual blocks of text are going to be encountered.
That's fascinating. And any one of those could be the only capsule that the guest happens to encounter as they're wandering.
Indeed. And so on the one hand, you don't want to be repetitive, but on the other hand, if there are a couple of core points, you may need to make those more than once because people might skip some. A very challenging just physical structure for words that really made me think hard, because even when you're writing a comic book script versus a screenplay versus a novel, people are still encountering them in the order in which you meant them to.
That's true, though in games, sometimes not. Well, you have to be aware that somebody may not encounter a particular bit of text or route around it, or if you've not thought through all of the possible combinations of play space, and the fact of the matter is with any complicated play space you probably haven't, they may encounter, the same bit of description here or over there. So most of the game work that I've done has been in sort of choose your own path style gaming, where there is a certain amount of time lock. You're kind of, the reader is, or player is, working through the events of the story, reaching choice points frequently, and then making choices.
Are these some of the choice of games?
Yeah, these are with choice of games. It's a really fun format. And then I've also done some interactive television, which has worked on a similar model. And the challenge is coming to this from prose, science fiction, and fantasy. One of the many challenges is that if you do exposition, you really, really need to be sure, if it's load-bearing exposition, that everyone sees the exposition or that they encounter it in different ways. So if you make a choice that means that this character who is most ideally positioned to explain what's going on in the plot, or at least their perspective on it, is now your grievous enemy and doesn't want to give you the time of day and wants to undercut you at every instance, how does your character understand what's happening? Who else is going to give them that information, and under what circumstance? So the cause and effect starts to really cascade. Not quite the same experience as museum exhibiting, but not entirely alien to it.
Yeah, they share that the person is moving from the arrival point to the end point, but you do not know exactly by what route, and you can make it be that there are moments where they have to go through a doorway and therefore they have to see the text that's by the doorway. They have to do this one event and therefore they have to see the text that's in the one event. But for the rest, you do have to plan for the meandering paths.
One thing that I quite love about Walt Disney World, actually, the modern iteration of any particular Disney theme park, I'm thinking specifically of the Magic Kingdom in Orlando right now, is designed to be experienced in many ways, on many layers, depending on both your own orientation within the space, your kind of level of interest, and sort of what you're there for. So there's like the most obvious one is like the children who are there because they're excited about meeting Mickey Mouse, or they want to ride on a roller coaster or whatever. But then there are also increasingly these experiences that are woven in and around through the usual guest stories. Like there is a event experience in the Magic Kingdom in Adventureland called, I think, The Quest of Jack Sparrow. And it's a sort of treasure hunt through everything around Adventureland that involves like taking this RFID tag that's your like magic medallion and going on a pirate LARP treasure hunt story and finding secret tags, touch these 7 symbols in this specific order. And then when you do that, something will physically happen in the park, like a cannon will fire or a skeleton impaled on iron spikes will rise out of Tom Sawyer's Lagoon, which happened to me once. And so like the physical conditions of the park will change in a way that feels extremely unusual and magical if you've not seen it before. So there are people who are running around who are doing this, and there are people who are just trying to get Dole Whip, and there are people who are trying to engage in the giant magic duel game that Disney has also implemented throughout the Magic Kingdom, all at the same time running through different stories. So you can be in a different park functionally, like even if you really know the kingdom quite well.
As I said at the beginning, this ran a little long, and we're going to be continuing it next time. Tune in for the rest of this in our next exciting episode. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives International 4.0 license. So, until next time, ex urbe ad astra.